my name is Kevin, and I'm a pretty big fan of movies. Over the course of my life, I've seen more than a handful of movies, spanning a bunch of different genres and different directors, different actors, and I feel like I've come to a place where, regardless of whether it's to my personal taste or not, I'm still able to discern quality to a fairly reasonable degree. However, there's one particular subgenre of films that, especially in more recent years, I've had a lot of mixed feelings about, and I haven't exactly been able to figure out how to express that frustration, for want of a better term. And that genre is faith films. Earlier this year, at the end of January, I visited my good friend Matthew at school, and during the weekend that we were together, one of our topics of discussion was Christian media. After I expressed my frustration with the current state of faith films, he asked me an interesting question, one that I hadn't really considered to a great degree before he asked it. What, in your mind, would a good faith film look like? Now, almost 2 months later, I feel I'm at least close to an answer to that question. For the purposes of this video, I'm going to be discussing the specific movie that brought these frustrations to the forefront of my mind, and seeing what it got wrong and how to improve on those particular problems. The movie in question is God's Not Dead, and for anyone who hasn't seen it, this video is going to be going quite a bit in depth to the story elements of the movie, so if you don't want any spoilers, this is your best time to leave. Also, just as a side note, I'm primarily going to be dealing with the dramatic and literary aspects of the film, because while I have gotten a lot more interested in the technical aspects of filmmaking recently, I don't consider myself to be any level of expert on those particular subjects. Not that I consider myself to be an expert on dramatic or literary aspects, but I'm much closer to an expert in that than I am in technical filmmaking. Whenever there's discussion around the generally lacking quality in Christian media, a common phrase repeated in defense of them is, it's not about the art, it's about the message. Any and all artistic shortcomings are hand-waved by the fact that, as long as we get the message right, as long as we're saying what it is that we need to say clearly, we don't need to be at the forefront of our fields. We can get along with being okay as long as the message is there. However, I, and many Christian artists with whom I've discussed this, would contest that the message and the art don't exist independent of one another, and in fact, there is a great deal of reliance between the two in order to have a high-quality Christian media. What do I mean by that? Well, let's say for a second that you made the best possible movie you could ever think of from a pure filmmaking perspective. All the camera work was on point, the sound mixing was perfect, shots were interesting and dynamic and unique, characters were well realized and had motivations that made sense. You get the idea. But there's nothing there to suggest any level of Christian theming of messages about faith. So, while it certainly wouldn't have been wasted effort, you made a really amazing movie, it fails as a faith film because the message isn't there at all. There's nothing being told about faith. In the same way, if you had the most clear, most biblically sound message that you could think of, say for example, God's Not Dead, but it's trapped behind a messy story, characters that are flat and don't really have clear motivations, and scenes that pretty much feel like they're in the movie just to pad the runtime to feature length, well, you've failed, because no matter how good your message is, it's become inaccessible due to the inherent problems of the movie. In addition, by not paying as close attention as you could to the artistic elements of the film, you've communicated that you really don't care that much about what it is you have to say, whether or not that's actually the case. So, with that in mind, let's go ahead and look at God's Not Dead. The movie opens with a montage of most of the main characters starting off their day, and Josh, the main character, is registering for classes for his first year of college. One of his classes, Philosophy 101, is taught by Professor Radisson, an atheist who requires all of his students to sign a piece of paper saying God is dead on the first day of class, or else they'll fail. Josh refuses on the grounds that he's a Christian and he doesn't want to put his name to saying that God is dead, and so Professor Radisson challenges him, saying, "If you don't do this, then you are required to defend the existence of God in front of the class for the stakes of whether or not you'll pass my course." This debate comprises the central conflict of the movie, and the majority of the pacing is built around getting to each new debate portion. However, this isn't all there is to the movie. There are a number of subplots going around, most of which are only tangentially related to the main storyline. There's Reverend Dave, a pastor at a local church who Josh has some brief encounters with when he's first discussing the conflict of whether or not he should take on this debate with his professor. And Reverend Dave is taking Reverend Jude, a missionary in an African country that I don't believe is ever specifically mentioned, but I could be mistaken, and I'll possibly have to go through the movie in order to figure that out, to Disney World, but they keep having car problems, so they're forced to stay around for the general events of the film. Amy is a blogger who starts off the film by interviewing Willie Robertson from Duck Dynasty, essentially attacking him for his faith and trying to get him to trip up in some way or another, I assume, for whatever reason. Also, she literally has a bumper sticker that says, "I heart evolution." And I'm not saying that that bumper sticker doesn't exist, and it was obviously some sort of attempt at characterization without dialogue or something like that, but the fact of the matter is, that's gotta be the weirdest idea for a bumper sticker I've ever heard in my life. Even if it's real, who would put that on their car? But that's not the point. The point is, she finds out she gets cancer, and her whole life begins to kind of fall apart, and she begins to question her own lack of faith. Martin is a student in Josh's philosophy class who begins to struggle with the whole faith thing. Look, I could be here for a really long time if I were to talk about literally everything in the movie, but the point that I'm trying to get at is the movie lacks focus. It tries to wear a bunch of different hats, and ultimately comes off feeling like there are a bunch of movies they were trying to make, or that it was really more of a made-for-TV film, but some executive or producer decided, hey, we're gonna make this thing feature-length, and so let's staple on a bunch of scenes that don't actually really impact the main story all that much. And that brings me to my first few points. 1. Faith films shouldn't be afraid to be faith-based short films. I'm a firm believer that brevity is your greatest ally when it comes to storytelling. There's no particular reason to spend 2 hours on a topic when you could just as easily discuss it in 20 to 30 minutes. I'm genuinely of the opinion that God's Not Dead would have made for a much more interesting series of short films rather than the feature-length film that we ended up getting. And 2. Focus primarily on telling human stories. A common thing you'll hear spoken about in artistic circles, especially in theater, is that art is a reflection of the human condition, or the human experience. That is to say, the primary purpose of art isn't necessarily to entertain, but to help us grow into a greater understanding of who we are. As much as a debate being the central story of a film can work, 12 Angry Men being an amazing example of how a technically debate movie can be incredibly interesting and engaging, the fact of the matter is, most of us won't ever really find ourselves in a circumstance that's relatable to the main conflict of the movie. And before any of you get on me saying that this is based on a handful of true stories that actually happened, just because something happened in real life doesn't mean that it makes sense. So I guess my real problem with the film isn't so much that something like this could never happen, but that if it does happen in real life, and since it has, any onlooker will wonder what in the world the people involved are thinking. And for what it's worth, I feel like some of the subplots in the movie have way more potential to make a feature-length film, but I'll discuss that a little bit more later.